Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the Fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. In recent weeks, we've been considering the lives of the Cappadocian Fathers of the 4th century, and today we will consider the youngest of them, Gregory of Nyssa. We will also spend some time with Gregory's sister Macrina, who is often called a mother of the Church. The Cappadocian Fathers lived and taught in lands that are today in central and eastern Turkey. The Roman province of Cappadocia was governed from the city of Caesarea, and the bishop of Caesarea from 370 to 379 was Basil. Basil was, by all accounts, the dominant and domineering force in the lives of the other two Cappadocian Fathers. Gregory of Nyssa was Basil's younger brother, and he was younger by many years, perhaps a full decade. Their family was prominent in the Christian community. One of the grandparents had died as a martyr. Their parents were quite wealthy and influential in the region. And several of the 9 siblings in Gregory's generation are today honored as saints in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Gregory of Nyssa was a fairly typical little brother. When he was very young, he worshipped his older siblings and stood in awe of their accomplishments. Their father died while Gregory was small, and so various family members assumed important parental roles in his life. By Gregory's own account, his brother Basil and their sister Macrina exercised an outsized influence on his development. The family homeschooled its children. Gregory later claimed that Basil taught him everything he knew about philosophy, and Macrina taught him everything he knew about religion. This was certainly an exaggeration, but it shows the regard he had for them early in life, and much later on after they both had died. As he entered adolescence and young adulthood, however, he grew critical of his family members, especially for their piety, which he thought was excessive. It's not that he was tempted to unbelief or serious sin. In fact, he accepted baptism fairly early in life, whereas many of his contemporaries deferred it till old age. And afterward, Gregory was admitted to the order of lector, or reader, in the Church. This was commonly a step along the path to holy orders and the clerical state. But Gregory stepped off that path, choosing instead to get married. Now, very little is known about Gregory's marriage. None of the primary sources mention the name of his wife, though scholars and churchmen throughout history have identified her with one or another 4th century Cappadocian woman. We don't know if Gregory's wife died young, or if they made a decision to put aside conjugal life and pursue celibacy and asceticism, either separately or together. The 4th century provides many instances of couples choosing these various paths. What we do know is that he found marriage to be a relatively unhappy state. Relative, that is, to the monastic ideal of virginity and celibacy. We know also that at some point Gregory joined his pious family members in their communal life that they shared with others on the old family estate. Unlike his brother Basil and their close friend, Gregory of Nazianzen, young Gregory never traveled abroad to study in the 4th century's Ivy League. Yet he may have been the most deeply cultured of the 3 Cappadocians. In young adulthood, he worked as a professional rhetorician, as his father had before him. Though he received his training locally, it seems he pursued it ardently. He may have been an autodidact, but he was an energetic reader and researcher. He consumed the classics and the works of the early Church Fathers, but he also actively engaged the works of his contemporaries, especially in the fields of philosophy and the natural sciences. He was especially interested in the intellectual traditions of the school of Plato. We have no evidence, however, that he committed anything significant to writing in those early years. The earliest composition we have from his pen is his treatise on Virginity, which he wrote while his brother Basil served as Metropolitan Bishop of Caesarea. In our last episode, we saw that Basil, as bishop, was a master strategist in ecclesiastical matters. Some of the other bishops in his region were advocates of the Arian heresy in one or another of its permutations, and so Basil was rather desperate for allies in the episcopacy. Thus he pressured his friend Gregory of Nazianzen into accepting the role of bishop in a tiny, remote, rural church. Around the same time, he pressed his younger brother Gregory into service as bishop of a tiny, remote, rural church in Nyssa. Gregory was not very happy about this development. Like the other Gregory, he probably squirmed a bit under the heavy hand of Basil. But the younger Gregory also showed no aptitude for the job. His brother Basil wrote repeatedly to reprimand him for his decisions, his naivete, and his mismanagement of people and finances. Basil even wrote to inform Gregory that he would not be included as a member of Basil's special delegation to meet with the Pope in Rome. The people in Nyssa were similarly unimpressed with Gregory. They accused him of wrongdoing and embezzlement and succeeded in getting him deposed and exiled, though he was rehabilitated and restored after a couple years away. Throughout these years, we see no clear evidence of the gifts for which he would be remembered. He produced no great intellectual work of which we are aware. It is only in 379, with the death of his brother Basil, that Gregory seems to come into his own. There are many ways of interpreting this. The elder of the two was already known in his lifetime as Basil the Great. Perhaps Gregory had been content to live in Big Brother's shadow, leaving the heavy lifting to the stronger personality. Perhaps he had been driven to inaction by his brother's frequent reprimands. At this remove, we just don't know. The record shows, however, that Gregory immediately began to flourish after Basil's death. He became not merely an occasional writer, but a prolific writer, arguing the case for Nicene orthodoxy and opposing the many strains of Arianism that were pandemic in Cappadocia. Gregory emerged immediately as his brother Basil's heir and successor, not as metropolitan bishop, but as the most articulate voice raised in defense of the Church's apostolic tradition. He completed several works his brother had left unfinished at the time of his death. He also dared to correct the points where he believed his brother had been erring. He was called upon, moreover, to play an active role in the life of the Church. In 379, he was summoned to a synod in distant Antioch, a journey of nearly 500 miles. The church there was a hot mess of factions and heresies, each claiming at least one man who claimed he was the city's bishop. At that gathering, Gregory showed himself to be a master of negotiation and diplomacy. Maybe his brother Basil had been wrong in judging him incompetent. Or maybe Gregory had grown up. In any event, he was now recognized throughout the Christian world as a fixer, and for the rest of his life he would be called into service for such missions. On his return home from Antioch to Nyssa, Gregory stopped to visit his sister Macrina, the sibling who had influenced him most profoundly. He found her gravely ill. In fact, she was dying, though she tried to conceal her symptoms from him. He was still grieving the recent loss of Basil, and he had hoped to find consolation by reminiscing with Macrina about old times. But now his grief was renewed and doubled. In the course of the visit, Macrina does console Gregory, but not by means of nostalgia. Instead, she reminds him of the immortality of the soul and the doctrine of resurrection. She confronts him with the reality of death, but in the context of the eternal life bestowed on Christians in baptism. From this visit, Gregory produced two of his most famous works. The first was composed soon afterward. It is his dialogue on the soul and resurrection. He cast it in the style of Plato, and intended it as a corrective to Plato's dialogue The Phaedo. Much later in life, Gregory composed his biography of Macrina, which presents his sister as the paradigmatic saint, her life the very model of Christian perfection. In the months that followed, Gregory went on missions to the nearby cities of Ibora and Sebaste. Both places were suffering the kind of division he had seen in Antioch, and in both places he brought about resolutions that were acceptable to all parties. In fact, in Sebaste, the people were so delighted that they acclaimed Gregory as their new bishop. Somehow, he extricated himself from that, managing instead to install his brother Peter there as bishop. Till that time, Gregory and his brother Basil and their companion Gregory of Nazianzen had struggled for the Orthodox cause against an Arianism that was supported by the emperor. In 380, their fortunes turned with the rise of Theodosius I. The new emperor was a devoted and determined advocate of the doctrine of Nicaea, and he intended by every means possible to make it universal in Roman lands. The elder Cappadocian Gregory, Gregory of Nazianzen, was already in the capital city, where he served as unofficial pastor to the Nicene community. It was inevitable that the younger Gregory, Gregory of Nyssa, should come to the emperor's attention. Bishops convened in the capital in 381 AD for the Council of Constantinople, which would be known in history as the Second Ecumenical Council. At these sessions, the two Cappadocian Gregories came to dominate. The elder Gregory, however, did not persevere and resigned before the council's conclusion. It fell to Gregory of Nyssa to finish the job, which he did magnificently. From that time on, he was recognized as a great eminence in the church. The emperor called upon him as a preacher, eventually asking him to preside at the memorials for his wife and his daughter. Gregory also continued his ministry as an ecclesiastical fixer, traveling to troubled churches in Palestine and Arabia, taking their sad songs and making them better. At the council, and immediately afterward, his consuming work was the refutation of Eunomius of Cyzicus. Eunomius was an extremist member of the Arian party, and he was very articulate and very persuasive, and by this time quite elderly. His most famous work was his Apologia, his Apology, which set out his reasons for holding to Arianism rather than the doctrines of the Council of Nicaea. This work had been refuted, and most people thought defeated, in a refutation by Gregory's brother Basil. Eunomius took his time in responding, however, and didn't publish his Apology for his Apology until 14 years later, and by then Basil was dead, and so he could not respond. But Gregory could, and did. He wrote several major works systematically refuting Eunomius, and his response was so thorough that he neutralized Eunomius as an authority and influence. In his time, Gregory of Nyssa was best known for this particular work. He was an especially effective hammer against heresy. Over the centuries, however, he has been recognized for his singular and positive contributions in a number of fields of theology. He was the first Christian since Origen to undertake a systematic and summary treatment of the faith. He wrote his Great Catechesis as a guidebook for teachers, but it is much more than that. It is a brief, systematic Trinitarian theology. Gregory's systematic work is marked by a deep knowledge of the theological currents of his time and of recent history. He assimilated what was good in the philosophical work not only of Christian authors, but also non-Christian Platonists and even anti-Christian Neoplatonists. At the turn of the last century, there was renewed appreciation in academia for Gregory's place in the history of philosophy. Later in the 20th century came an explosion of interest in the spiritual theology of Gregory's later years. It was then that he produced his Life of Moses, his homilies on the Song of Songs, and his insightful meditations on the opening chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. In these works, he shows the spiritual life to be a way of gradual purification and illumination, a step-by-step movement Godward. The 20th century theologian Louis Bouyer described Gregory of Nyssa as, quote, one of the most powerful and most original thinkers ever known in the history of the Church, unquote. Father Bouyer summarized Gregory's spiritual theology this way. Gregory's fundamental conviction was, quote, that the soul is created to the image of God, and that the progress of grace and of ascetic effort restores it to that image. More precisely still, it is the soul's most intimate nature to be not a mere image, inert and as it were separated from its model, but rather a mirror in which the presence of God is revealed as the soul gives itself up to the divine advances." Unquote. Many of the great lights of 20th century theology devoted studies to the work of Gregory of Nyssa. Hans Urs von Balthasar did. Jean Danielou and Herbert Musurio provided a great service in compiling an anthology of Gregory's mystical writings. By training, Gregory was a rhetorician, and he communicated in the fashion of his time, which is definitely not the fashion of our time. Danielou's selections make the great saint digestible for us in the 21st century. We do not know when Gregory died or where. Around the year 395, he simply vanishes from the historical record. But by then he had made his ineradicable mark on history, and he remains an inspiration, especially for those who experienced disappointments early in life, and who head even into middle age feeling like failures. In his words and in his deeds, Gregory showed how a Christian life can turn on a dime and turn toward extraordinary sanctity. In our next episode, we'll voyage beyond Cappadocia. We'll even stray beyond the church itself as we study the life of a man who was not a father in any sense of the word, who was, in fact, an ex-Christian who despised the church and tried to bring about its demise. He is known to history as Julian the Apostate, and he was Roman emperor for a brief time in the mid-4th century. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider making a contribution for the continuation of the series. The Way of the Fathers is listener-funded, so we're dependent on the generosity of people like you. Please pay us a visit at catholicculture.org/donate/audio and leave us a note if you love the Fathers. We pray for our benefactors every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. It's a film club devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture Podcast.